I'm Renny Hartman. Again, I've been associated with Literary Gladiators for a few years. Josh was a former student of mine from now years ago. And in the summers, I have gone back to read novels that I either didn't read in my novel course in college or should be, I think, read if you're involved with literature. And I started a few summers ago with War and Peace, which was so long I read two other Russian novels as a break. And I had Moby Dick as the last novel in my novel course, and I have to say, I never finished. I read to the sermon where the minister is in an altar that's the prow of a ship and quit. And then some years later, it's maybe 25 or 35 years ago, I started it again. I got to the same place and I stopped. I just thought it was too dense, too thick, too heavy, not really interesting, and not introducing facts or characters that were worth paying any attention to. So I had decided that this was a book I would do this summer. Next summer I'm going to do The Red and the Black by Stendhal, which I read in high school and can remember nothing of. And this time my reading of Moby Dick, which took me longer than it might have because this text is in about 8-point font, as if you were reading classified ads all the time. There's couple hundred chapters in this book because the type is so little. They're really not long, but the truth is, from the first chapter until the last three, you don't actually get to the whale itself. You hear about the whale, you hear about Ahab, you begin to see and hear a little bit more about Ahab as the book progresses, but mostly Ishmael, who is our narrator and who says, "Call me Ishmael," a famous first line, is interested in other things or exploring other things or just the whaling industry and whales themselves. He, as a character, was in the Merchant Marine, and when he's introduced at the beginning of the book, he's penniless. He wants to get on a whaling ship. He wants to be in Nantucket to do this, but he starts in New Bedford to begin with. And he comes to an inn where he can get, for whatever, half a penny, he can get something to eat and he can get a place to sleep, but he has to share the bed. He can't afford the whole bed by himself. And this is how Queequeg gets introduced, who is very tall. He's tattooed blue all over and says he comes from an island that's not mentioned on any maps, Kosovo, and that he was a king's son, so he was a prince, but at some time a whale ship stopped in at his island and he left with them because he wanted to see the rest of the world. And now he says possibly his father has died, but he can't go back because he's too contaminated by the rest of the world. Interestingly, actually, the Pequod is very much a whole bunch of different people. There's people from Tahiti, there's people from Persia, there's people from, at least three blacks from the south, and the cook is one. And I guess the cabin boy Pip, who plays the tambourine, but also goes out sometimes on the small whaling boats he falls in, is also one. We have a couple Indians who are harpooners. So I would say it was a UN ship. The Pequod, who was famous itself, and I would say would be a he ship, but ships are always she, they're always females, so are airplanes, and so are cars. So when the ship is referred to in the book, the ship is referred to in the feminine as a she. And the ship is not owned by Ahab, although he calls it my ship, and he says he has never put out on anything that wasn't his ship. But the ship is owned by two other retired captains. At first, when finally Ishmael and Queequeg get to Nantucket, they don't want to hire the Samoan because he's not Christian, and they only want to hire Christian sailors. but quickly takes out his harpoon and throws it several hundred feet and hits something dead center, and they're really impressed by that, so they do hire him. Now, in the beginning of the book, when we have the two of them, there is quite a bit about him, and the fact that he smokes a pipe that's also a hatchet, it's also a tomahawk, and that he and Ishmael, when they first meet and start to become good friends, they share that smoking that pipe. Then as the story moves on, and even though he is a harpooner and he's successful in bringing in whales for the ship when they eventually get to do actual whaling, he's kind of lost in the story and doesn't come back until at the end. There is not much running plot really in Moby Dick. I think that's one of the reasons perhaps it was not considered a masterpiece when first written. Something like Fitzgerald's Great Gatsby, he had two famous earlier novels, and then when he produced The Great Gatsby, it was not immediately considered either critically or popularly famous for him. They did pretty soon they did a silent movie, which I have not seen. I've seen 3 Great Gatsbys, but I never saw the silent movie. They did one in 42 with Alan Ladd. They did one in 74 with Robert Redford that I think is terrific. And then they did the Lurman with DiCaprio. DiCaprio was good, I think, as Gatsby, but the rest of the movie was not really that terrifically based on the book. And there is a Moby Dick that I saw years ago, I believe in high school, with Gregory Peck. And I remember that the whale had blue eyes. I think if it's a white whale, it probably would be an albino and probably have pink eyes, but I don't know. The white whale has all kinds of symbolism for the book and is also very unusual and very important to the whaling industry in a way. We meet other places and peoples that have seen it and run into it. Ahab, the reason he's on this particularly sailing is that he's been doing this for 50 years. Since he was 18, so he's 68. There's actually a number of quite elderly people on this boat. The man from the Isle of Man, the black cook, and a couple other people are mentioned as quite old, which I thought was interesting for the book also, because at the time, probably mortality would have been in the 40s, early 50s at the outside, and to be off they went out for 2 to 4 years on the whaling ships out of Nantucket and New Bedford. So they were gone long periods of time with very diversified types of people on the ship who, I think there's 40 on the ship. You in the book, you probably meet 10 enough so that they have character development, like Starbucks, who is the first executive, Stubbs, who's second, and Flask, who's third. So when they take the 4 boats out to chase whales, that would be Ahab in one, Starbuck in one, Stubb in one, Flask in one, and whoever gets the whale, when they come back, they get treated like it's their 50th birthday or their 100th birthday. They get the first steak from the whale. They can tell how the whale should be divided up, whether its flukes should be pickled. They tell you all the ways that whales are cooked and give you all kinds of recipes. That's something else that is in the book. When there is not plot moving, which there very often isn't, Ishmael will tell you the history of whales. He does a whole history of whales before Darwin and probably is pretty good, except that he insists that they are fish because they're in the ocean, and only fish can be in the ocean. Now he knows that they have live children, that the children suckle, because he has seen the females with the calves, but he still calls them fish, and he says they're on a fishery. That is their purpose in life. Now, when they first leave, it's freezing in the winter, and then they hit the warmer equatorial areas, and I thought at first they were going to go around to the Pacific at the bottom of South America, the Cape of Horn, but they don't. They go to Africa and go around the Cape of Good Hope, and they don't do their first whale until they actually get into India. They are interested only in the sperm whale because they want the oil from the head of the whale. Now, this I can tell you because I have read this. A bull male sperm whale can be 60 to 90 feet. 2/3 of it is the head. So in my living room here would fit the head of a large sperm whale. But the first 20 feet are the oil that is kept at the beginning of the sperm whale. And it's not until you get back to where its ears and eyes are that it has its brain. So the whole front of it is the oil. And I looked on Google to see why in the world this would be, and of course they don't really know. They think the oil has something to do with their sonar and something to do with their buoyancy. I don't know if that's true or not. I can tell you this, when they take a whale, and the whale, that might be 4 or 5 miles from the ship, they have to go after the whale and they have to pull the whale back. And then they have all kinds of chains and so forth that have the whale tied to the ship. Sometimes the whale is so big and so heavy it makes the ship move and look like it might tip over also. And they cut into that front of the whale's head and use buckets to just lift the sperm whale out and keep it in casks in the bottom of the ship, of which they can have many hundreds if they're really out for 2 to 4 years. And Ishmael even thinks about, if they take 10,000 whales a year, because everyone is doing this, the Dutch, the Canadians, the English, the Americans, the French, they're all looking for this whale, particularly from the sperm whale. Well, what will this do to them? I think at the time the whales had a shot. They would come upon a pod of whales that might be 10 to, it could be 50 whales, and they have to find one to hunt down, although the individual boats might go for different whales and see if they can get their own whale. I'm not sure how that works in their rowing, which has to be fast. The whale can go 25 to 35 miles an hour in the water. We cannot run that fast. I don't know that we can row that fast, but they have to get fast enough. One thing that works in favor of the whalers is that some whales become kind of entranced and stop running, and they can be harpooned and caught. Other whales, once they are harpooned or once they are lanced, will sometimes run away with the boat, sometimes sound. If the rope cannot run out of the boat, it will take the boat with it and it might drown the sailors. One incident that Melville based the book on is a famous, I think it's 1842 or 48, called the Essex in the Pacific, which is run into by a male sperm whale and wrecked, and the sailors become abandoned. It takes a month or more to get them before they are picked up. They are left at sea. And the whales sometimes do seem to attack, or whether they're just swimming and they run into the ship, or they sound, and when they come up the ship is on its back and they knock it over. But the whales, I would say, had a much better chance when people were throwing a harpoon. When we come into the modern age where they were harpooning like with torpedoes, shooting them at whales, that was not a fair shot, and we had depleted whales enough that they became specialized, privileged, and maybe have recovered. I'm not sure. Ahab had faced Moby Dick some years before. We're not really told exactly when, but had lost his leg, and he had a whalebone as the peg leg on his foot, on his leg. When he first comes on the ship, something like Gadsby, you don't see Gadsby for, I don't know, 20, 25, 30 pages, 40 pages into Fitzgerald's novel, and you don't see Ahab until possibly a third of the way. He comes on as the ship's captain, that have hired Ishmael and the other sailors. And then he goes to his cabin. He stays in his cabin. He only comes out at night to begin with. I don't know if that's a symbol of him. There is tremendous amount of religious symbolism in Moby Dick. Ishmael was a son of Abraham, and according to the Old Testament of the Bible, his people lived in the East, and now Islam claims him as a founder. Ahab was an evil king of Samaria. He married the wicked Jezebel, who insisted on worshiping her idols, and he built temples to Baal that made him also non-Jewish religion and evil. He was involved in a number of wars and did not end well. So I don't know exactly if that's why he is Ahab. Ishmael is an orphan in the Bible, and of course he becomes the only one who survives and is an orphan of the Pequod at the end. But there are just tons of other allusions in the book. Ishmael may not have been well educated, but certainly Melville was. Not only that, there's tons of classical allusions in the book that I like my students to try and learn something that they can see them. Although I saw one that I couldn't back up. He said that whales should be presented to people as dignified and respected as war elephants were in the time of Alexander the Great, and that Alexander the Great was presented a war elephant with its tusks gilded and wearing flowers and all dressed up. And I can't find this on Google anywhere, and I don't know if I could remember. I've read Plutarch, Arrian, Curtius, and Diodorus Siculus. It's as close as you can get to Alexander as we can get to him in written material. And if it's in one of them, I don't know where it is, and Google didn't give it to me. But I will say Ishmael thinks quite highly of the whales. And I think part of that also is that although they can take a whale every now and then, and meet other ships also that have done so, there are still more whales than there are ships, and in a pod, maybe only one whale will be taken out of 10 to 50 or 60, and the rest have a shot at really surviving. And they get some that have been attacked. They have a harpoon in them, they have a lance in them, but they have survived it. They are wrapped, it's called a blanket, in their blubber, and I think that unless it hits a vital organ of some kind, that quite possibly it seals up or it is even pushed out. Moby Dick himself is very, very scarred from all of his life when they come upon him, and Melville does not say what happens to Moby Dick at the end, and I can't say that anyone can really tell, and I would hope that he did survive, although he's all wrapped up in ropes. I guess the ropes will rot and fall off eventually, and he has been harpooned in several places. There's a 3-day chase for him. That's the very end of the novel. You get into the Indian Ocean, and that's where they come upon their first whale, and it's not until they reach the seas around Japan that they start seeing large numbers of sperm whales. And then Ahab puts them on a southwest run towards South America, and evidently there was a real whale in that area that the Indians called Mocha Dick, M-O-C-H-A. Does that mean he was brownish? Mocha, who supposedly had sunk 29 ships himself. So whether Moby Dick comes from him, I'm not entirely sure. Nobody else is. But as they do that, and as they get into the equator, Starbuck, for one, wants Ahab to stop. They have at that time filled the hold with the number of barrels of oil that they think they can hold, and he doesn't think that they should go on. He thinks this is a monomania. Actually, Ishmael calls Ahab a monomaniac, whose only interest really is in Moby Dick. Even though he's out whaling, he does some of the whaling with the men, but for the most part, that's all he is interested. He wants to take vengeance. He thinks that Moby Dick hates him, and he hates Moby Dick, and that they are bound to meet each other mano a mano, and that this time Ahab will win instead of the whale winning. It takes a long time to get to Moby Dick. Although you meet other people, you meet a ship called Rachel, and she, in the Bible, loses her children and is looking for her children. She weeps all the time. She has a captain who has lost an arm to Moby Dick, and he has a whale piece for his arm, although that was the year before. He hasn't seen him recently. So that there are other people that have run into this particular whale. And he also seems to appear. People tell stories about they were in a pod and they were out whaling, and then all of a sudden Moby Dick appeared and he interrupts the chase, so that he sounds a little bit sometimes like the Lone Ranger. He can appear in places and go places that some of the others can't or don't know, mostly the Pacific. I don't think he's considered an Atlantic or Indian Ocean whale, so they're looking for him in the Pacific, and he's spoken of as being in the Pacific. But he appears in other stories in different ways, as if somehow he can manifest himself as they are whaling, and he can interrupt the whaling and stop it from happening. Now there's 3 days of the chase at the very end of the book. They are not really good days. For one thing, I don't see this quite as well as the critics do. Supposedly there's a major religious theme here of the Zoroastrian versus the Christian. We certainly actually get so-called pagan business in here too, with Queequeg, Tashtigo, and a couple of the others who are Indians. They are Persian. They are not American Christians or British Christians by any means. The Zoroastrians go back pre-biblical times into ancient Persia, and he has Persians with him who make predictions for him. Predictions, unfortunately, come true, but they are in riddles, such as who will go first, and who will see a hearse, and who will go second, and what that hearse will be. And so those things will happen, but it's not a hearse such as you would take to a funeral home in Toms River, New Jersey. This hearse is a whale. And I don't think that the whale goes to the funeral home. I think the whale probably gets away. I also do not understand how everything goes down in a whirlpool, in a sense. I have looked that up. They mentioned this several times, how the whales swim around and create a kind of whirlpool. Whether this is an actual event that can happen or has happened, I don't know. I thought the book was very, very engrossing, and actually in places much more humorous than anyone would imagine. I did not consider it as dense and heavy and disinteresting as I thought when I was a college student, and even maybe 30, 40 years ago when I was just middle-aged instead of now becoming quite ancient. But I really was just thrilled with the book. I thought Melville was terrific. I loved all the material on the whales. And I'm glad that it has now become a classic. It took till about the 1920s for critics to discover Moby Dick and decide it was a classic. And interestingly, Melville wrote other novels that I haven't heard of, Tippy and Umo, that were in their time evidently very, very popular and made him a big best-selling author. And I don't think those are the books that anyone really reads today. What they read is Moby Dick, and I would say that Moby Dick is really worth the attention and interest that anyone could give to reading.